All right, we're ready for Judges 17 and 18. Judges chapters 17 and 18. And at this point in the book of Judges, we shift gears. And I want us to talk a little about that, of what we're accomplishing here, at least what the writer is accomplishing, and what's going on in the shifting of gears, or by that we're moving to a new section. I've shared with you Micah's outline of the book of Judges several times, the need, the work, and the time of the judges, and he breaks it off between 16 and 17. And so 17 to 21, he calls it the time of the judges, a description of the corruption and the anarchy and the apostasy that was true of the time of the judges. We'll say more about that here in a moment. We've been generally following Wiersbe's outline, and he calls the three sections apostasy, apathy, apostasy, and anarchy. And so we began the section of anarchy. So the gear shifts right here between 16 and 17. Now, we've looked at the matter of the apathy, and we just finished with Samson, but Samson is not the last judge. Now, Samson went from 13 to 16, chapters 13 to 16, but he's not the last judge. Judges drops off with this right here. And we don't see Eli and Samuel till we get to 1 Samuel a little bit later. So, what's the point of the rest of the book here? Well, the rest of the book then, beginning at 17 through 21, as Micah calls it in his outline, the time of the judges is descriptive of the chaos and the apostasy and the immorality and the wickedness that went on during the time of the judges. This is not intended to be chronological. In fact, we're going to give some evidence this is not chronological. What I mean by that is, don't assume that Samson has just ended his reign and now we have the case of Micah and his idolatry, and then we have the case of the concubine in chapter 19. This is kind of, as one writer calls it, an appendix or an addendum to the book that tells you something about what went on during the period of the judges. And we'll give some evidence of that as we go along. So what Wiersbe suggests here, and I think is a pretty good outline, we have idolatry, chapter 17 and 18. And if you've read your lesson for tonight, you know that's what the primary thought is how they were steeped in idolatry and how far it went. Then we're going to see in chapter 19 immorality. And we'll see the case of a Levite and a concubine. And then we'll talk about civil war, as he calls it here, in 20 and 21. Now, let's give a little evidence of that, starting in chapter 17 here. As I've already mentioned, this is describing anarchy and apostasy. This section, I'm talking about from 17 to 21, is describing anarchy and apostasy. Again, it's not chronological, meaning it follows immediately after this, but it describes the time, nor is it describing the time just after Samson. I've already tried to establish that. But it seems to be about the time, at the beginning of the time of the judges, that the events of chapter 17 and 18 take place. Josephus puts it shortly after the death of Joshua. Now let's notice in chapter 18 and in verse 1, to give us kind of a time bearing of this, in those days there was no king in Israel. Now, we'll come back to that phrase. It's found in chapter 17. We see it in chapter 18, and we'll see it again. There was no king in Israel. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means, I think, simply the fact that there was a lack of leadership. They haven't yet reached the point of being king. They've had judges, but even as the judges are just coming on the scene, there was no king in Israel. Meaning there was a lack of leadership during this time. And while there was no king in Israel, here's what they did. Furthermore, verse 1 talks about, concerning the tribe of Dan, that they were seeking an inheritance, for until that day their whole inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them. So that's going to put me put this a little bit earlier than just after the time of Samson. Now let's get ahead in chapter 18 and in verse 30. I'm trying to give evidence that this is not sequential or chronological. Chapter 18 and verse 30 talks about that how the tribe went, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later, what happens with the reference to the tribe of Dan going and seeking land to the north and capturing land to the north, what that was all about and when that took place. But this was until the day of the captivity of the land. Now, I'm going to reserve my remarks about what captivity that is, but I don't think that's the Assyrian captivity, but perhaps talking maybe about the Philistine invasion. I'll give evidence maybe why that's true a little bit later, when we get to 18 in verse 30. So what I'm trying to describe for you is there seems to be evidence that this is backing up and going back maybe to the beginning of the days of the judges, maybe shortly, as Josephus suggests, after the death of Joshua. So with that in mind, what this section is again not chronological, and that's a little hard for us to do. We just finished Samson, and so we think this is the next thing that happens. Not necessarily. It's like reading a history of the United States, and maybe you read the period of a certain 20-year period, and then at the end of that book, there is an addendum and a footnote that talks about some things that took place during that 20 years, and it's not necessarily chronological. That's what's going on seemingly here. So the book of Judges drops off here with Samson, and we have Eli and Samuel yet to go, but we're going to talk about them a little bit later and not in these chapters. I'm going to skip the cycle for a moment, and let's move on to chapter 17. Chapter 17, question number 1. What's the main point or summary of chapter 17? Yeah, Micah's idolatry. Then we see the impact of that when we come to chapter 18. But question number 2, a short summary of chapter 18. What's 18 about then? Yeah. Here is a whole tribe, basically a whole tribe. I don't mean every single person there, but basically as a tribe, they endorse and accept idolatry. And they get carried away with that, and then that becomes a major problem for them for days to come. Let's go and get question number 3. What did Micah's mother make with the 1,100 shekels of silver? Verses 1 to 5. Golden image, image or an idol is what she made or made idols from that. Now let's start with chapter 17 now, and there's 2 things that happen in chapter 17. Micah and his mother make idols, and a Levite becomes a priest to Micah. Now I want you to get the picture of what's the purpose. This is not just a storyline that we want to know who Micah is, and we want to know about what all he did, but it's providing evidence of how corrupt things were. If you want to talk about how corrupt maybe people in government are, you might cite some random cases. You might cite, okay, here is a senator that did thus and so, here is a president that did thus and so, and here was a congressman that did thus and so, and here was a judge that got paid off. And what you're trying to document is the storyline, not of the history of these people, but you're just trying to document corruption. And that's what's going on here, seemingly. So let's start with verses 1 to 6. Micah and his mother make idols. So here's what happens. Now, Micah returns stolen money. I want you to notice the number of sins that are involved. We're going to list these a little bit later in the case of Micah. There was a man of the mountains of Ephraim whose name was Micah. And he said to his mother, this seems to be his confession where he's bringing the money back, the 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken, on which you put a curse, even saying in my ears, here is the silver with me, I took it. And we'll get to the rest of verse 2 in a moment. It seems that there's two schools of thought, seemingly, at verse 2, what took place. He obviously is acknowledging, I stole the 1,100 shekels of silver. But there's 2 schools of thought about the her putting a curse and the saying in the ears. That one is that she had been suspicious he might steal that, and so consequently she puts him under oath, don't you steal it, and he promises he wouldn't steal it, but he stole it anyway. Others think, and perhaps this is the case, that someone had stolen it, and she was suspicious that he stole it. This is a corrupt family, and she would think that's my first thought is, in her mind, that my son has stolen it, and so she puts him under an oath and makes him swear, and finally he caves to the pressure and he confesses. That may be the case. And either way, he's coming confessing and acknowledging, I was the one that stole it, here it is, and I bring it to you. And then what does she say? Seemingly a response to his acknowledgement that, okay, I stole it and here it is and I'm bringing it back. Some writers refer to that as his repentance, that he's sorry that he brought it and I regret that I stole it and I'm bringing it back and I'm trying to be honest and here it is. And what's her reaction now at the end of verse 2? Yeah, may you be blessed by the Lord. What does she mean by that? Well, I think verse 3 is going to help us with that. That when he returned to his mother, what did she say about the money? May you be blessed of the Lord. And I'm going to paraphrase and you finish my sentence. She basically said, well, what I was going to use that money or that silver for I was going to make some idols out of that. That's what I was going to do. And I had wholly dedicated the silver from my hand to the Lord for my son. In other words, I had you in mind in this. So you bring it back, so may you be blessed of the Lord, because I had dedicated this to the Lord to make a carved image and a molten image. And thus when he returned it, his mother took 200 shekels, and she does what with that? Take it to the silversmith so he can mold it and shape it and make a god out of it. And they were then placed in Micah's house. And so the man Micah, verse 5, had a shrine and made an ephod of the household idols and consecrated one of his sons who became his priest. Now, it's interesting that back at verse 2, and I will make this point when we get to verse 13, this is part of the corruption. They seem to have some connection with the Lord and talk about the Lord's blessing us and we're worshiping the Lord, but they're coupling that with the influence of idolatry, which we saw in the first, the first 3 chapters of the book of Judges. So he's coupling it with the idolatry that's going on and trying to worship God and idols at the same time. And so he has this and he makes his son a priest. Now verse 6 is a commentary for the whole period, and that is, in those days there was no king in Israel. So this is prior to the kings. This is an event that takes place prior to 1 Samuel chapter 8 when they demanded a king. They've been talking about kings all through the period of the Judges. They'd like to have a king, but they haven't done that yet. And because there was no king in Israel, every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Question number 4, you should be able to finish that with verse 6. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. What does that mean? That had a connection, by the way, there being no king in Israel. It's not just saying this was prior to the kings, but having no king meant something. What did it mean? I'm sorry? They didn't have a leader. To say the least, they didn't have a leader that was pointing them in the right direction, that was pointing them toward the Lord. And in the days when there was no leader or a lack of leadership among those leaders that they may have had, then every man did that which is right in his own eyes. In other words, they did pretty much whatever they wanted to do. Now, if you don't have this reference elsewhere, chapter 18 verse 1 says there was no king in Israel. Chapter 19 in verse 1 says there was no king in Israel. And chapter 21 and verse 25 is the verse you really want to note, that there was, in those days, there was no king in Israel. And then we have again the statement, and the book of Judges ends on this note, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Pretty much they did whatever they wanted to do. So you want a summary of the book of Judges? Look at 17:6 and 21:25, and everyone pretty much did whatever they wanted to do. And that's why we give emphasis to the cycle of the Judges, is that when they came back to the Lord, they served the Lord for a while, and then next thing you know, they're going back as soon as that judge dies, meaning as soon as they had leadership gone, they revert back to their sin and they go into sin. And they quit serving God and they come back around and a leader gets them back serving the Lord, then they go back into sin. So that's the significance, I think, there was no king in Israel. In other words, not a perpetual king. There was a judge, and when he died, there wasn't a judge that immediately followed him, but there'd be a period of oppression before there's another judge. Does that make sense? That there were gaps in the leadership. They had a judge, but then he'd be out for a while because he died, and then God wouldn't raise up another judge until they were oppressed again. So they didn't have continual leadership. to direct them and guide them, and therefore they did what was right in their own eyes. So, Micah made idols. He and his mother made idols, made his son a priest, and the reason for all that, everybody's doing pretty much whatever they want to do. Now let's start at verse 7. The Levite becomes priest to Micah. What's the point, or what's the story here beginning at verse 7? All right. He'd already appointed a priest, contrary to the will of God. And now here comes a priest. So there's a young Levite who was staying in Ephraim. Let's get the picture, verses 7 and 8. He was from Bethlehem in Judea, and he was a Levite, and he was sojourning there. The idea of sojourning, your footnote may say something like residing temporarily there. In other words, he's looking for a place to move. He's looking around where he might go. And so he comes to Ephraim, and he runs into Micah. Verse 8 says, the man departed from the city of Bethlehem, and he sojourned, and he came to the mountains of Ephraim and came to Micah. What did Micah ask him now, beginning at verse 9? Where are you from? I'm a Levite from Bethlehem, and I'm looking for a place to live. And so Micah said, what, verse 10? All right. So basically, you want to be a priest? Now, God's system of priesthood is in place, and he didn't ask him, would you serve at the tabernacle, but would you be my priest with my idols? He's already got his idols set up, and his son is a priest. I need another priest here. And would you be my priest, and I'll pay you well, and I'm going to give you, according to verse 10 shekels of silver for a year and a suit of clothes and your sustenance. In other words, I'll provide all that you need. I'll give you all of that. And interesting, the next phrase is, so the Levite went in. In other words, the price sounded good. Yeah, I'll be your priest. For that kind of money, I'll be your priest. Now, what you're going to see is he's a man that's for sale. And we're going to see that a little bit later. Now, beginning at verse 11 through 13, what happens? Yeah, he consecrated him, or basically ordained him. The footnote, whether this is the more literal rendering or not, I take that it probably is by being the footnote at verse 12. So Micah consecrated him. Literally, it means filled his hand of. In other words, he made him a promise. You come and be my priest, I'll give you all of this, the silver and the change of clothes and all your sustenance. I'll provide all the food and give you all of this. And so he consecrated him by paying him off and giving him whatever he wants. And that's how he makes him a priest. He buys him and makes a priest out of him, and he lived in the house of Micah. Now, verse 13 is let's go to our question first. And now let's get the point of the verse first, and then we'll come back to our question. Then Micah said, now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since I have a Levite as priest. Question number 5. What was wrong, if anything, with what Micah said? Verse 13. All right, good point. He's only trying to fulfill part of the law, not all of the law. That's good. What else? Exactly. He appoints him as priest, but that's not the priesthood that he's supposed to be a part of. What else? He's serving idols, not serving the true living God. What else? He's for sale. As soon as somebody comes along and pays more, makes a better deal, he's gone. And that happens. Now that's interesting. He assumes he knows what God wants, more than what God wants. But he assumes that, not because he's consulted the high priest, and the high priest has told him what the revelation is, or that he's consulted a judge, and the judge has told him what the revelation of the Lord is, or that he consulted the revealed will of God, and he knows what God's will is. he assumes that God's with him because I've got a Levite with me. And we'll make some practical application of that here in just a second. Let's go back to the phrase of what he said. He said, now I know the Lord will be good to me. Anything wrong with that? No. Can I know the Lord will be good to me? Yes, I can know that. And could a Jew say, I know the Lord is with me, and because I have a Levite as priest? Could they do that if they were serving God correctly? Yeah, when the priests are doing what they should. It is he takes that concept and applies it to his circumstance without any evidence thereof. Now, let's talk about something practical. Let's get ahead of ourselves and look at a practical thing at verse 13 here. In what way might we be saying that I know the Lord is good to me since I have a Levite as priest? Now, none of us are going to say we have a Levite as priest because we don't have a Levite. I don't know of a Levite. Do anybody know a Levite? None of us know that. But in a sense, we might claim we have a Levite as priest. I know the Lord's good to me because I go to Church of Christ. Good point. Yeah. I know the Lord's with me because I go to the Church of Christ. Now, I may not be living right. I may not be doing what the Lord wants me to do. I may be involved in sin, but I go to the right church, so I know the Lord is with me. Good application. Let's go again. I know the Lord is with me because I'm rich. The Lord's blessed me. So I know the Lord's good to me. I know the Lord will be good to me. I know I'm doing what's right because the Lord has abundantly blessed me. I know the Lord is with me and is good to me because I do good works. Look at all the good I accomplish. I help those who are in need, teach Bible class. You see the point? I know the Lord is with me because I have godly parents. I assume that I'm going to be godly and am considered godly because I come from a godly family. Been several times I've talked to someone who may be the son or the daughter of a well-known gospel preacher, and they're unfaithful. Not the preacher, but the daughter or the son is, but they claim, look, you don't know who you're talking to. My dad is a gospel preacher. And I'm thinking, yeah, so what? What's the big deal? That doesn't make you faithful. But I know the Lord is with me because I have a Levite as priest. Any other application? Yeah. We come from a family of Christians. My parents were Christians, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. It goes back for generations. So I know the Lord's with me. He's been with the family. Micah made a fatal assumption. Wiersbe observes this. He said, Micah broke 7 of the 10 commandments without ever leaving home. What an accomplishment. Isn't that interesting? I don't know whether it was 7 or 6. I didn't go back and figure all that up. But interesting, he broke 7 of the 10 commandments without ever leaving home. I know he has idols. I know he didn't honor his father and his mother. I know he coveted. I know several of the commandments he broke, and he never left home. Micah perhaps is like many today who in their homes, they worship money. As he did, he seemed to worship that which is foreign to God. Anything else on chapter 17 before we move to 18 now? Yes, that's a good point. I know the Lord's with me because this doesn't bother my conscience. That is interesting that he was content to dwell with the man. I mean, this works as long as I'm look at what he's providing for me. And he's taking care of me, and all is well and all is good. All right, don't miss the storyline. The storyline is not so much we need to know all about Micah as much as we see the spiral downward because of idolatry. That they've gone so far as making of their own idols. And this is children of Israel, by the way. This is not the strangers of the land. The children of Israel making idols and then making priests to serve those idols and worship God with idols. And we see their error. All right, let's go to question number 6 before we get into 18. that question should not be why, but what was the tribe of Dan wanting to do? That may change your answer, but go ahead and give your answer anyway, whether it fits or not. What were they wanting to do? Yes, and I'm going to come back later to Joshua 19, not Judges, but Joshua 19. We'll save that for a little bit later. But I think Joshua 19 may come to play here that this fits an earlier time. Again, this gives me evidence when I get to verse 1 and 2. This is not fitting right after the time of Samson, but this fits an earlier time. And a couple of references I would give would be Joshua 19:47. I'm going to focus on that a little bit later. And then Judges chapter 1 and verse 34. So Judges 1:34 and Joshua 19:47 suggest this took place much earlier. Much earlier and at the time, at the close of the book of Joshua. Now, let's work our way through chapter 18 now. In answer to that question, as was already given, they see, what question was that? Number 6. They wanted to go elsewhere. They wanted more land. They were not satisfied. Joshua 19 tells us they were not satisfied. They had been driven from their land in part, so they're kind of roaming around looking for more land. So here's what we have. 5 things. The Danites accept idolatry. That's the major storyline here. And they take Micah's idols. That was interesting to them. That's something they wanted. And not just for the value of the silver, but they wanted that because they want to worship those idols. So let's see what happens here. Let's start with the spies of Dan spy out Ephraim. And so this gets us through verse 1 through 10. Beginning at verse 1. Again, here's the dating of this. In those days there was no king in Israel. And those of the tribe of Dan were seeking inheritance for themselves, for until that day the whole inheritance among the tribes had not yet fallen to them. And again, for a cross-reference, if you don't already have it, Joshua 19, verse 47, and Judges 1 in verse 34. So what did they do? Verse 2, 3, and 4. Verse 2 and 3 particularly. Children of Dan sent how many men? 5 men, men of valor from Zorah and Eshtaol. And what are they going to do? They're looking for a place. Not just they're just a place they can raid and then gain the booty and come back, but it's the idea of they're looking for land where they can settle. And we're looking for more land than the land was given to us down here in the south. As you remember, by the time we get through the book of Judges, in fact, by the time we get through with tonight's lesson, we have 2 sections of Dan. There's Dan to the north and Dan to the south. Dan to the south has already been given, but the Dan to the north is going to be captured in our study tonight. So they send 5 men out looking for the land, and they go search the land, and they came to the mountains of Ephraim, and when they come to Ephraim, they come across the house of Micah that had been introduced in the previous chapter. What do they find when they get to Micah's house? Yeah, they recognize something about this Levite, and they ask him questions like, who brought you here, and what are you doing here, and what do you have here? And he said, thus and so Micah did for me, and he hired me, and I've become his priest. In other words, he paid a good price, and I'm willing to be his priest, and I'm doing whatever I need to do for him. I'm his priest. Now then, verse 5 is a key point. What do they do at verse 5? Absolutely. Please inquire of God that we may know whether the journey on which we go will be prosperous. Now they're out looking for land, and we're going to take and seize some land. That may involve killing some people. It may be driving some people out. We're looking for land other than what's been given to us down here. We're looking for land that we can occupy. And you tell us, consult God and tell us whether or not this way will be prosperous. Now, what's wrong with their request? Well, God's already given them their inheritance. That's true. If you were of the tribe of Dan and you happened to be along with this group, probably shouldn't have been, but if you were, and they raised that question, what should you have said about how we're going to know what the will of the Lord is? They should have gone to the high priest. They've gone to a man, they happen to just run into a man who is a priest, and they recognize and see there's idols there. He's a man who's trying to serve God, perhaps. We'll give him credit, he's trying to serve God, but serve God and serve idols at the same time, or serve God with idols. So they recognize he's a Levite, and he's a priest to this man. He's already admitted, I'm a priest to Micah. And consequently, they should have recognized this is not a man who is following the will of God, but they're not interested in following the will of God either. So inquire of the Lord for us, they said. And we want to know if our way is going to be prosperous. And so what did he say? Verse 6. Yeah, God's going to bless you. Your way's going to be prosperous. The Lord's behind you. The Lord is supportive of you. You go forth and you do the will of the Lord, and you're okay. There's got to be something practical from that. What would it be? From that scenario. They went to this man that they shouldn't have gone to, and they asked him, what would the Lord have us to do? And he said, the Lord wants you to go on. And they said, great, we'll go on with the blessing of the Lord. Go straight to God. That's good. All right, that's good. If somebody wants to do something, they'll find somebody that'll tell them, and they'll find that person who'll tell them they're okay. You want to divorce your mate for any cause, you find somebody to tell you you're okay. If you want to drink, you'll find somebody to tell you it's okay. If you want to do it, you'll find somebody to tell you you're all right. Quite often we go to the wrong source. We go to the world for advice about how to raise our kids, and then we walk away thinking we have the blessing of God the way we're raising our kids. We go to the world for advice on how to conduct our marriage rather than consulting the will of God. They went to the wrong source. They went to a man who was not even a proper priest, but he's a priest of idols, not serving God at Shiloh. And he says, go in peace, and they go forth. Now, beginning at verse 7, let's get through verse 10. They come to Laish, also known as the city of Dan. So let's find that on the map, first of all, and then we'll come back to our text. This is Dan to the north. Now, what becomes, by the end of the chapter, Dan to the north. This is Naphtali, and this is Manasseh right here. And here's Dan to the north, and there's Laish, that became known as the city of Dan. Named after their father. But there was another name that's given of that you'll find elsewhere in the text that we'll talk about perhaps later if time permits. Now, so that's where they head off, and that's where they go. Now, beginning at verse 7, let's get through verse 10. They went to Laish, and they saw the people there. What did they find when they got there? Easy pickings, exactly. They dwelt in safety. That means the idea of dwelling in safety, there was no military protection for them. And the Sidonians, who had the ability to fight them off, were ways away, according to verse 7. There was no rulers in the land, and they had no ties with anyone. And so they basically said, came back and gave their report that, hey, let us arise, go look at verse 9, and for indeed it's very good, and don't hesitate, we'll go and possess it. So we found the spot. We went up here to the city of Laish, and it's easy pickings, let's go. There's not going to be a big fight, let's go take the land. And by the way, we know God's behind us, because Micah's priest, the Levite, told us everything was okay. All right, let's begin at verse 11 now. What do they do? Verse 11 to 13. Absolutely. They gather 600 men and armed with weapons of war, and they come and they camp for temporarily at Kirjath-jearim. And they then came to the mountain to the house of Micah, the 5 men leading them there. What do the 5 men do when they get verse 14 now? They come and stay at the house of Micah, then beginning at 14, let's get 14 to 18. Now that they're at the house of Micah, these 5 men remember something. All the idols. So the 5 men have gone out to spy and said, do you know that these, what's in the house? And I'm paraphrasing it, verse 14. Have y'all seen what's in the house? The idols and the carved image and the molten image. Consider what you should do. They tell the men, the 600 men, right over here in this house is some idols. Y'all do what you need to do. And now what do they do? Verse 15, 16, 17. Now that's interesting, an interesting take on that. I like what you said. Let's go back to that phrase at verse, look at verse 14. The 5 men told the 600 soldiers, now consider what you should do. If you didn't catch what Ricky said, they didn't do what they should have done. What they should have done is destroy them. Because they were told to destroy all idols once they got in the land. And the people who were serving idols. They didn't do what they should have done. But they didn't do what they were told to do by the 5 men either. So the 600 armed men, they stood by the entrance. Who else is standing at the entrance as these 5 men go in and steal the images? The Levite, who is the priest. And he asked at verse 18, what does he ask? What are you doing? What are you taking? And they tell him, verse 19, yeah, let's reason about this. Do you want to be the priest of one man or the priest of a whole tribe? And the man's heart was glad, and he took the ephod and the household idols and took his place among the people. He found a higher bidder. Are you for sale? I know gospel preachers that are for sale. What would I mean gospel preachers, or what were supposed to be gospel preachers for sale? Absolutely. I want to keep my job, so I'm not going to preach against something that may cost me my job. I don't want to ruffle feathers. I want to be of influence. And so if I preached on those kinds of things, I wouldn't be invited to go in meetings. But since I want to be invited, I'm going to kind of curve my strong preaching and teaching. Are you for sale? Micah apparently was for sale to the highest bidder. And they make him a better deal, so he goes with them. So let's get down to verse 21 to wrap that section up. And he took the idols and he turned and went with them, and he took off with them, basically, is what we're learning down through verse 21. So he went to the highest bidder. In the interest of time, let's move on. I don't want to go there yet. I want to back up right here. Let's start at verse 22. The Danites take Micah's idols and they have a confrontation with Micah. Micah comes after, this is almost humorous. Micah comes after them and he overtook the children of Dan. And what takes place? The people of Dan ask him, interesting question, what ails you? What's wrong with you? That you come out here with a band of men chasing after us that way. And his answer was, verse 24, you've taken away my gods. It's interesting, these gods couldn't even defend themselves. That's interesting. You have taken away my gods and the priest, and now what more do I have? In other words, you took my religion away. You took my religion away. You took my priest and you took my gods. I don't have anything left. Do you have the kind of religion somebody can take away from you? If you have the religion of God, nobody can take that religion away. They can't take your God. They can't take your priest. Nobody can take your high priest away from you. Nobody can take your God away from you. But if you have the kind of religion that can easily be taken away, you've got the wrong religion. That's interesting. And so he recognized that he couldn't overpower them. And so what does he do? He turns around and goes back without his God, What a sad picture. He's got a religion. He's still got a religion, but he doesn't have a God anymore. He doesn't have his gods anymore. He's got a religion, but he doesn't have his gods. And so they took them away. Now, we've got time to work through verses 27 through the end of the chapter. They finally go and they settle, 27 to 30. Let's get that. They settle in Laish, and they call it Dan. And so I want to give some references on that and try to tie this together, make a few comments on 30 and 31, and we're going to be done. They came to the people of Laish, and they cut the city down, burned it with fire, and there was no deliverer as far as Sidon, so they had nobody to defend them. And so they rebuilt the city according to verse 28, and they called the city Dan after their father. And so what do we have here? What we have is them moving to the north and taking over, and that's when that Dan to the north is formed at this juncture. Now, a couple of references here. Let's go back to Joshua just for a moment, chapter 19. I said we'd come back to this. Joshua 19 is dealing with the division of the land. Verse 47 says, and the border of the children of Dan went beyond these, but the children of Dan went up to fight against Leshem. That's the same as Laish and Dan. That's the same city. 3 different names given in the text. So that's the same city. And they took it, and they struck it with the edge of the sword and took possession of it and dwelt there, and they named it Dan after their father. So here is a reference to that back in the book of Joshua. Same event, same circumstance. Now another quick reference, chapter 1 of the book of Judges, and in verse 34, that the Amorites forced the children down into the mountains and would not allow them to come down in the valley. That seems to be when they were migrating north, looking for a place to go. So a couple of references about all of that taking place. Now, so that's how that Dan to the north. And as we were dealing with the tribes earlier, we talked about Dan, but we didn't talk about Dan to the north. And that's because this is being formed right here. Now let's talk about they accept idolatry, 30 and 31. And so we get a little more information here at verse 30. The children of Dan set up for themselves the carved images. They took these idols and went and they set them up for themselves. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, I take that Jonathan, and I think several commentators take this to be the case, that's probably, that's the same man that was that was the priest, the Levite that was the priest. Now there's a textual issue here, for what it's worth. It's called the son of Manasseh. You may have a translation that says he's the son of Moses, actually a grandson of Moses, or great-grandson, I forgot which. And so don't get excited about it. That's a textual issue. And part of that's because some could not fathom that a descendant of Moses would go after idolatry. Well, I could imagine anybody could go after idolatry. Now, the other textual thing I want us to focus on is at the end of verse 30, they served these idols until the day, and these idols that were until the day the captivity of the land. So what captivity is talking about? Well, it could be Assyrian captivity in 722, but that's a long, long way off. And maybe so. But if so, then the writer of the book of Judges had to be writing from the vantage point of 722 or after, or some have suggested that may have been inserted in later. I don't necessarily buy that. It may refer, and I can't be convinced fully, that it may refer to the Philistine invasion that was mentioned just prior to the time of Samson. So from the early days of the Judges up to this time, the invasion of the Philistines into the land, and they're occupying the land, that they were given to this idolatry the whole period. Now, I don't know if that helped you or confused you with reference to that. But here's the storyline. It's the degradation of the time period of the Judges. They're spiraling downward from the very beginning into idolatry. So no wonder we have the ups and downs of the Judges. Questions or comments? Got about 30 seconds. Makes you wonder, did he begin to think, now I know God's not with me because he let my God get stolen. And then notice also an interesting point. He didn't say, I still have the God of heaven. He was more concerned about losing his gods. All right, chapter 19 next time.